Today's speaker is Brody Dunn. Brody is a visiting extension outreach associate focused on pollinators and beneficial insects. We're really looking forward to your presentation, Brody, so I will turn it over to you.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, Aaron, well, thank you for the introduction. My timer restarted here. I guess without further ado, we'll get started here. Tricky pollinator questions and answers. Aaron, you already did the introduction. I can skip a slide. So first, I'm going to tell you where these questions are from. Then I'm going to tell you the questions, and then I'm going to tell you the answers. But they're going to be kind of silly answers. We're going to go back. We're going to address each question individually. We're going to explore the science. We're going to revisit that original kind of silly question or silly answer, but now with this added context. Then we'll try to get to some of these pre-submitted questions that you guys submitted to us. And if we have time, we'll do some Q&A at the end. All right. All right, so where are these questions from? Well, they're requests from educators. And I've only been at Extension for a little under a year, and our Extension educators are pretty bright folks. And they managed to do just fine answering pollinator questions before I was here. That means that they can answer most pollinator questions. And when they forward these questions to me, it's usually for a really good reason, right? So sometimes it's tricky because it has lots of exceptions and caveats. Complicated, it's difficult to sort through. Sometimes there's conflicting science, right? So one scientist says one thing, one scientist says another. They say, Brody, who's telling the truth? Sometimes it's a new issue and there's incomplete understanding, right? So it's so new that science has not had enough time to sort of chew through it, right? So we have an incomplete understanding. All right, so here's the questions and their answers, right? And these are kind of knee-jerk, silly answers, right? So question one, does it help pollinators to not mow my lawn? It depends. Question two, are cultivars of native plants pollinator friendly? Maybe. Question three, are monarch butterflies an endangered species now? Yes, and also no. Question four, does rearing monarchs help their population? No, but you should still do it in some cases. All right, question five, are my annual plants junk food for pollinators? Probably not, except in some specific cases. And then question six, can I help pollinators if I can't garden or don't own land? Yes, and the way that doesn't need a garden can have just as much or more of an impact. All right, so let's look at these questions in more depth. So does it help pollinators to not mow my lawn? This is a question, it's a recurring question that Extension gets starting in March, going through April, running through about mid-May. And it's all because of one program. It's called No Mow May. But what's No Mow May? No Mow May is a program run through the Xerces Society. It's part of their Bee City USA initiative. And it started in the UK by another organization. I think it was called Plant Life. And this is important later, and you'll find out why. It's seen, since Xerces Society has taken it over, it's seen increasing popularity, especially in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. And well, what is it? Well, it's just what it says on the tin. Don't mow during the month of May. Don't mow during May. That's what it is. There's a few other little things in there, but that's really the gist of it. And it's sort of predicated on this notion that, well, actually, a lot of these things that we consider to be weeds in our lawns, pretty good pollinator plants. Clover especially. Clover is a real good pollinator plant, right? And maybe if we don't mow these down, that it'll provide some floral resources during this critical early spring period, right? But there's some problems with No Mow May. One has to do with the growing season. I said they started in the UK, and that it's got popular in the Northeast and upper Midwest. Well, in these locations, if you don't mow during the month of May, grass gets pretty tall. It gets pretty tall. But if you don't mow in Illinois in May, which is much further south, it gets really tall, really tall. Maybe not quite this tall. I think this is an alfalfa field. But it gets so tall it can cause problems, right? So your grass might need 2 passes, right? Where it's really tall, it might get yellow underneath, right? Where the top of it of the canopy is blocking the sun, the bottom. And theoretically, and this is issues that other extension units had to deal with, other extension agencies, it might be costly if you have somebody come mow your lawn for you, or it might harm your equipment, right? And this is a relatively minor concern, I think. I think. One of the other issues that we run into is actually the city code. So lawn height is really tightly regulated in most cities. And in fact, it's so tightly regulated, this image, why am I showing you the city of Salisbury, North Carolina, right? Well, I went to a public domain image search engine and I typed in no mow May lawn, right? And I found a lawn that looked really great. It was very clearly participating in no mow May. I clicked on it and it redirected me to the city of Salisbury's code department, right? So clearly this is probably used as like an example of what not to do or something like that, right? But the thing about these, it's really tightly regulated, lawn height is, and it's also complaint enforced, right? So maybe you have a dinner party with some neighbors and you and 2 or 3 neighbors decide you're gonna do no mow May. And it's halfway through May and you guys haven't mowed, and someone down the road, some neighbor that's not on board, hasn't heard about no mow May, sees that you haven't mowed your lawn in 2 weeks, and they call up the city and they say, oh my God, you're not going to believe how tall this lawn is. It's crazy. There's snakes, there's deer, it's all these terrible things, right? And then the city has to send their landscaping enforcement uh, uh, employee out to give you a ticket, right? And 5 or 6 people do this in a city, and it causes problems during May, right? But back to the question. Those are just problems with no mow May. Let's go back to this original question. You'll recall I said, well, it depends. Well, it depends. What's it depend on? It depends on, well, one, your neighbors in your city, if they're going to be sort of tolerant of having a tall lawn. Also depends on what's in your lawn. So if you'll recall a couple slides back, we had these 2 images up. I was sort of using them as an example of, well, this is what an unmowed lawn looks like, but I kind of lied. That's not necessarily unmowed lawn. In fact, one of them, I think it's just the edge of a forest. So I lied on that one, apologies. But the bottom one here is definitely somebody who is participating in no mow May. But the thing is, they've gone out and they've purposefully seeded their lawn with a bee lawn mix, right? So it's got a ton of it's a really dense mix that you toss out, and all these clovers grow up, right? It's purposefully, intentfully seeded ahead of May to make this as valuable as it can be to resources, or to pollinators. But the thing is that most lawns don't look like this. Most lawns look more like this, right? I mean, so most lawns have a couple flowers in them, but a lot of lawns, and especially in urban spaces, do actually just look like this. And if your lawn looks like this, you're not really helping pollinators by growing it out, because it's just grass. You're not offering any floral resources. But there's a little asterisk on that, which, well, it does kind of help with air pollution, because gasoline-powered lawn and garden equipment is shockingly pollutant. It makes a pretty substantial impact on air quality. In fact, these lawn and garden tractors and weed whackers and so forth account for, let's see, have it in my notes here, half of non-road emissions. So not including cars, but half of non-road emissions, and 5% of total air pollution. And this is especially because of things like weed whackers, these 2-stroke engines, right? So theoretically, you get enough people in a city doing this, not mowing, you can actually probably have a measurable impact on air pollution, right? But this is very abstract. It's a little farther away from pollinators than we intended to go, right? And I just want to have a little bit of an aside here to say that if you go to one of those public domain search engines, you type in like public domain lawn, you get one lawn in particular. And luckily, this served our purposes, right? It's just that most people don't have a Hercules helicopter and a Washington Monument in their lawn. All right, but moving on. So if you participate in this, I highly recommend that you talk to your neighbors first. And even if they get on board, I highly recommend you put in buffers. So on the far right-hand side here, you can see the university has put a buffer around a no-mow area. And a lot of times city code actually requires that. And I would also recommend that you read your city's code to make sure you're not going to get a surprise like $500 ticket in case somebody complains, right? consider mowing once halfway through May, because really this should be no mow April in our area, in our growing zone. That's just more what would make sense. But if you're going to do no mow May specifically, then you should probably mow at least once, just to avoid the issues with tall grass. And if you can, plant one of those high density flowering mixes, these B-lawn flowering mixes. If I've thoroughly put you off of no mow May, then there are other options you can explore. There are no mow and low mow turf replacements you can use. They have sedges and that kind of thing. You can also reduce your mowing schedule theoretically. This could help some of those clover come out. I also think it would be great if you could do an early flowering pollinator garden. That would also be helpful if you're really trying to get help to pollinators in this early spring period. All right, so does it help pollinators to not mow my lawn? It depends. Well, it depends on what your yard looks like, and it's relying upon what your city and neighbors will tolerate. If your goal is to support pollinators in the early spring, there might be better options. And there's another little caveat here, which is to say that if your city adopts the program, honestly, I would just go for it because there's positive impact. It's not hurting anything, right? Even if your lawn only has a couple of floral resources, only has a couple of clover in it, it's probably not hurting anything to let it grow tall, right? And maybe it will help with those couple of flowers, right? If the city is going for it, that means that you're probably not going to get a ticket, right? All right, question 2. Are cultivars of native plants pollinator friendly? And I said maybe. And we're going to breeze through this one pretty quickly. And that's because it's a really new issue. And we have a very incomplete understanding of it. You know, people have only been really putting native plants in the sort of home landscape. That's really not been popular for very long. There aren't many cultivars out there quite yet, right? And so science hasn't caught the eye of scientists yet. So there's still work has not yet been completed on this. But we do have some evidence that certain features may matter, specifically flower color. So on the left here, you have a purple coneflower, and that's just the wild type, the straight species. But then we have on the right a cultivar, and it has this kind of green tint to it, and this sort of soft white. And pollinators probably won't see this flower quite as well as they will see the straight species. Because they'll look at this and they'll say, oh, well, that's just a weird leaf, and they'll fly away, right? So there's some issues if you change the flower color too much. And flower form also matters. So this in particular is hot papaya variety. It's also purple coneflower, but it's a double flowering variety. And this variety probably doesn't produce pollen, but even if it does, even if it does produce a bunch of nectar, it's inaccessible to pollinators, right? So this is probably, you have to keep an eye on these weird flower forms, right? It may also be the case that leaf color matters. So a lot of these varieties have changed the leaf color. Now, and in the center here, you have a regular 9-bark, just a wild type 9-bark. And on the right, you have something, a variety that has red leaves. And the red is from anthocyanins. I forget what class of chemical that is, but it's not good for caterpillars. And it's not good for these other herbivorous insects. So they eat less of the leaves. So it's less nutritious, essentially. And on the left, you have a variety that more or less has less chlorophyll. And they found that in variegated varieties, actually more of the plant will get eaten by herbivorous insects, which of course this includes lepidopterans, so it includes butterfly and moth caterpillars, right? So more of it will actually get eaten, but it's not getting eaten because it like tastes better. It's getting more of it is getting eaten because it's less nutritious, and so they have to eat more of it, right? So it is doing a worse job of supporting pollinators in that way. So that's something we have to keep, maybe have to keep an eye on. But the thing is that this is so new that these rules have not necessarily been proven to be universal. And that's really unfortunate because that means that if we can't find these sort of universal traits and we can't, it means that we have to evaluate these on a case-by-case basis, which is horrible. That would be really unfortunate. So this is something to keep an eye on. So are cultivars of native plants pollinator friendly? Maybe. Cultivars of native plants may have traits that make them worse for pollinators. The science is still very preliminary. It seems like there are identifiable traits which can be avoided to retain those positive attributes, but it may also be the case that varieties will have to be evaluated one at a time. In the absence of informed guidance, it's probably better to choose wild type plants, specifically if you are gardening for pollinators. So if you really like the plant, go for it. But if you're trying to garden specifically for pollinators, probably a good idea to choose a wild type. And I've got just like with most of my answers here, I had a little asterisk, which is that there is some concern from some scientists that there will be gene flow moving from these weird cultivars into the wild populations. And the thing about cultivars that we put into our garden is that, well, they kind of need our help to survive. So they're not as good at surviving out in the wild. So that means if you have a cultivar and it sends its genes, some pollen from one of these cultivars, makes it out into the wild population could theoretically be less fit because of that. And we don't have any evidence of this yet, but it is something that I've heard scientists talk about. So that's just something to keep on the radar. All right, question 3. Are monarch butterflies an endangered species now? I said yes, but also no. Let's look into that. If you ask the US Fish and Wildlife Service, they will say we're thinking about it. If you ask IUCN, they'll say, yes, we just added it to the red list. So who's IUCN? IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They're an international organization headquartered in Switzerland. They do a lot of great work. In fact, I think IUCN is the largest conservation organization in the world, do a lot of awesome work. I think they have an advisory seat on the UN even. But they have this threatened species ranking called the Red List. And you have almost certainly interacted with this Red List before, because if you go to Wikipedia, it's this conservation status that they have on most common species and most well-known species, right? So you've almost certainly interacted with their Red List before. In July 2022, IUCN added the monarch to their red list, and it's specifically the migratory subspecies, because there's a non-migratory population that lives in, I think, Central and South America, and also on islands, I believe. But the migratory subspecies is the one that we deal with. It's the one that we see in Illinois. Let's see, here we go. So what does this mean? What is getting listed by IUCN mean? Well, they don't have any regulatory power. They have no regulatory power. And their classification confers no legal protections for species that they've classified as endangered. But their classification does shine a really big light on the species. It's a big flashlight right on them. And it makes other conservation organizations say, well, maybe we should look at this. Maybe we should spend some money on this. And it makes governments look at it like, okay, maybe we need to look at the species to see if it needs to be listed, right? So they're not powerless. They have a purpose and they serve their purpose well, right? Well, let's look at US Fish and Wildlife Service. They're in charge, the US Fish and Wildlife Service is in charge of assessing species for protection under the Endangered Species Act. And this is like when you hear people talking about the Endangered Species Act in the United States, this is what they're talking about. This is the act, right? And there's a process to get listed on under this legislation. First, you have to petition. You petition to get a species listed. And if the US Fish and Wildlife Service thinks it's merited, they'll do an assessment and they'll issue that assessment for comment. And then they'll make a decision based on the assessment and the comments they've gotten. And if they have an affirmative finding, then that does confer legal protections, and a lot of them. This is a very powerful law. It confers a lot of protections. In September of 2020, the US Fish and Wildlife Service issued their species status assessment report for the monarch butterfly, and they had a finding of warranted but precluded. So what is that? Well, warranted but precluded means that they think it might need to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. It might be threatened. It very well might be endangered, but they don't currently have the resources, or some other reason they can't list it right now, and they're gonna throw it into a process where they have to redo this every year, and so they'll keep reevaluating until they come to a decision as to whether it should or should not be listed. Now, theoretically, they're supposed to do this every year, but they're not doing it every year because they're really behind. There's a lot of species that they have to consider, and they're pretty underfunded, right? So it is rumored that they're going to get back to the monarch later this year or perhaps early next year. And that's not for sure. That's just a rumor, but that's what I've heard. So we might be able to revisit this pretty soon. So our monarch butterflies and, oh, excuse me, sorry, wait a minute. So what does the science say? Well, that report that they issued said that the probability of extinction is between 48 and 69% in the next 60 years. That's with current conditions. If conditions worsen, so if climate change gets worse, if we use more land, convert more grassland into agriculture, if we use more pesticides and more herbicides, then the probability of extinction raises to between 56 and 74% over the next 60 years. There has been more science that has occurred on the monarch since they've released this report. And the new science says that this species is extremely, extremely resilient. They're very resilient. So what happens, what this paper has found is that, well, the species leaves Mexico and they have these reduced numbers in Mexico, right? This is where they overwinter, and they basically explode out into the United States, and they totally, almost completely and entirely recover, right? They get almost up to what last year's numbers were. And then in the fall, as they come back down, going back down and fall towards Mexico, that's when they're losing all their numbers again. So basically what they're saying is this species is so resilient, they can explode out into the United States and they almost completely recover, even though they have these dwindling numbers in the wintering grounds. But they caution, because they say that this resiliency has its limits, because of course the species could never recover from zero, right? If there's none in the overwintering ground, they can't recover from that, right? But the point at which the threshold at which they're not going to recover from is certainly higher than zero, right? Maybe it's 100,000, maybe it's 1,000,000 individuals, who knows what it is, and they don't know what it is. So they caution, they say this resiliency has its limits. So are monarch butterflies an endangered species now? I said yes, but also no. An international conservation organization has declared that the monarch is endangered. The federal government, which actually has power to protect the species, is still considering the science. And the science currently says the species seems really resilient, but it still may be in trouble. All right, question 4. Does rearing monarchs help their population? I said no, but you should still do it in some cases. And the root of this question is really in the Endangered Species Act we were just talking about. Because we kind of know what we're doing. If we find a struggling population of some animal, we know how to solve that problem, right? Because this endangered species, we've been doing this for a while, since 1973. I think we've saved 14 species, right? We're getting pretty good at it. We've kind of got a roadmap. So let's go walk ourselves through this roadmap. Well, first you find the adults. You find the adults. You figure out where they're laying eggs and you steal the eggs. You take the eggs. You take those eggs, you put them in a box into an incubator. You hatch the eggs. Beautiful, cute little ugly ducklings here, right? Ugly chicks, right? Then what you do is you find someone who's really good at making a puppet, really good at making puppets, and someone who's willing to wear a puppet, and you raise the chicks up, right? It's really weird that I've never seen mom's wings, but whatever, that's fine, right? Then you take these, you raise them up to these awkward teenagers, and you keep them in a box. So you keep them from dying, right? You protect them until they're adults, right? And then boom, presto changeo, population recovered, right? And I can tell what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh my God, this is going to be so easy. It's going to be so easy because we don't even need the puppet. Monarchs don't care. Beta monarchs don't care, right? But there's an issue. There's some hurdles that are posed by monarch biology. One is that they have a totally different reproductive strategy. So instead of sort of caretaking this one egg or two eggs, they have really low parental investment and a ton of eggs. So they lay between 1 and 300 eggs, and they just anticipate many of them dying, most of them dying, in fact, maybe 2 or 3 live, right? That's very different. They also have this weird migration that happens, right? And of course, those birds that I was referencing, they also are at least partially migratory. Well, that migration is totally different from the monarchs because they have this intergenerational migration where for those that don't know, the individuals that leave Mexico are not the same ones that come back in the fall, right? In fact, they're I think the great grandchildren. It's 4 generations, right? So there's this really strange multi-generation migration that has to be dealt with. There's also some weird dangers that are different from a lot of the species that we've dealt with. So there's less poaching. There's different kinds of predation, mostly insect predation. There's also a disease that's pretty bad. This I can't pronounce. Honestly, I cannot pronounce this name of this protozoan parasite. But luckily in the literature they just call it OE, so that's what we're going to call it. And that'll come up in a minute. The big thing is that these butterflies have a very strange response to captivity, different from what we're used to. So redder wings in monarchs are associated with better health, and pointed wings are better for migration. And wild caught monarchs, which you can see on the right, have redder wings that are more pointed than ones that are reared, which you can see on the left. Wild monarchs are also stronger. So they have this little force meter, and they lower the butterfly down, and they let the butterfly sort of grab onto it, and then they lift up until the butterfly has to let go. And when they do this, the grip strength that captive individuals show is much reduced compared to their wild counterparts. And they're not sure why. They're not sure why. And I'm gonna kind of cruise through a couple of these slides because this is kind of a complicated thing to explain. But basically what's happening here is if you bring these monarchs indoors, they totally lose their bearing. They can't figure out where they are in the world. You try to release them and they're not flying in the right direction, right? Even if it's just for a brief period, even if it's just for eclosion, whenever they go into a pupa, it really messes them up, really messes them up. And this is something that we're very curious that we have not figured out the mechanism behind. I'm also gonna breeze through this one. So there was a scientist who reared a bunch of monarchs indoors and published a paper that said, well, they're flying south. And then someone else responded and said, okay, well, I looked at all the monarch releases that have happened in your area, which is Ontario, and they're all flying southwest, and yours are flying southeast. And if you know where Ontario is, it's sort of kind of next to New England. If you fly southeast, you're flying out into the ocean, right? And so there was a big fight between a couple areas, a couple scientists that played out over 5 or 6 publications. And this is basically what happened, right? But it seems like that we've sort of come back to this conclusion that it really does mess them up to have them indoors. Commercial monarchs, because there's been evidence that commercial monarchs actually make it to the wintering grounds, right? So you'll tag a bunch of these commercial indoor raised monarchs, and some of these tags are winding up in Mexico at the overwintering grounds. They thought, well, that must mean that they're okay at reaching Mexico. The thing is that they're actually probably just flying at random. It's probably totally random. So they might make it, some small percentage might make it, but it's not many. And actually they looked at the genetics of the commercial varieties, and they have more genetics of their genetics in common with the non-migratory subspecies. So that's why, right? They're flying at random because they don't have the instinct to migrate. They also have this issue with disease, this OE that I was telling you about. And this is not a picture of a monarch with disease because it's really gross. I didn't want to put a slide of it on or a picture of it on my slide. They just turned to it sort of a black goop. It's really gross. But it's fatal, often, nearly always, and it's really, really virulent in rearing conditions. And it's so virulent that even scientific labs that are dedicated to rearing butterflies for research specifically have issues with OE, and they have access to things like autoclaves and other sanitary equipment, right? And even they have issues. So it's really difficult to deal with, right? And really the bad thing about this isn't necessarily that you're losing a bunch of caterpillars, right? It is actually that some small percentage make it, but they are still infected with OE and they can spread it out in the wild. And so you can end up killing a bunch of butterflies unintentionally. So looking at this sort of from afar, rearing monarchs can cause issues with fitness, issues with migration, and issues with disease. But as you'll remember, I said, but you should still do it in some cases. Well, what are those cases? Well, education. Monarchs are really basically unparalleled in their capacity to be ambassadors for the insect and science world. They're beautiful as caterpillars, they're beautiful as a chrysalis, as a pupa, and they're beautiful as adults. And they've captured the imagination of thousands and thousands of kids. And that's really valuable. It's so valuable. And you'll even find that some conservation organizations that used to sell conservation kits, where you could raise these monarchs indoors for their conservation value, supposedly, are still selling those kits, but they're selling them for education. So I think that it's still very important to rear these. If you want to rear these with your grandkid or the neighbor kid or what have you, or in a classroom, that you should still do that. That's a great instance to do it. And if you're going to do that, please watch this video series. It's from Iowa State. Dr. Laura Jessie Isles is the host. She does a fantastic job of sort of walking you through what the container should look like and how to recognize OE and what to do if some of your butterflies get it and all these sorts of things. I think it's a 4-video or 5-video series, and each one's like maybe 3 minutes long. If you are copying down this link, it's going to be in the top right-hand corner in the next slide. All right, so does rearing monarchs help their population? Back to this question. No, but you should still do it in some cases. While it is probably not helpful to rear monarchs for the purposes of direct conservation, monarch rearing is an excellent and productive way to get young people interested in the natural world. All right, question 5. Are my annual plants junk food for pollinators? And when I say annual plants, what I've assumed that to mean is non-natives like petunias and that kind of thing, right? And if you're really, there's a bunch of information in this that I'm actually going to go through pretty quickly and just summarize. And that's because Dr. Christina Grosinger did a fantastic presentation on this, where mostly she talks about pollen nutrition. And if you're interested in what I'm talking about, you should watch this video. And just like last time, that link is going to be in the top right-hand corner over the next couple slides if you want to copy it down. All right, so are my annual plants junk food for pollinators? I said probably not, except in specific cases. To figure that out, we have to answer a couple questions. So what do pollinators need to live? Well, they need nutrition for growing and maintaining their bodies, and they need energy for living. And what do non-native annuals have to offer? Well, they have biomass, they have nectar, they have pollen. Of course, they have other things, but we're being simple here. We're simplifying. So let's look at biomass first. So plants go to great lengths to keep their leaves from getting eaten. And this causes a kind of arms race with insects. So they pack their leaves with poison so that the insects can eat them. But the insects want to eat, and over evolutionary time, these two go back and forth, where one is filling their leaves with more and more poison, and the other one is finding creative ways to deal with all this poison, whether it's enzymes or some kind of physical strategy, but they have this arms race that goes back and forth. And what this means is that insects that eat vegetation are typically confined to a small number of host plants with which they have evolved, right? And this also means that native insects are often confined to native host plants, right? With some exceptions, not very many, but some exceptions. So this means that our non-native annuals probably are not providing biomass, right? So we can cross biomass off. So let's look at pollen. And I'm going to cite Christina's presentation here again, because she really goes into pollen nutrition. And I'm only going to sort of gloss over it, right? So please watch her presentation. It's very good. Pollen is high in nutrients. And those nutrients, as it turns out, are variable by plant species. So does this matter in terms of whether or not this pollen is quote unquote junk food? Well, honeybee colonies, we know, are healthier when they have access to diverse pollen resources, right? So, and this makes sense. It's kind of like a balanced meal. We have peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the wheat in the bread and the peanuts, the legume, have overlapping protein, amino acids, right? So they form a balanced meal, complete protein, and it's the same principle likely for these honeybees, right? Furthermore, we're starting to think that maybe some bee species have certain pollen preferences. So they prefer pollen with a certain proportion of nutrients. So maybe this butterfly that we have, or excuse me, this bumblebee that we have in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen might really like fatty pollen, right? It only likes fatty pollen, right? And then something like this halictid over here on the bottom left, it might really, really like a high protein pollen, right? So some bees may prefer pollen with certain nutrient proportions. And Christina goes into really great detail in her presentation about this particular thing. The thing that may be the case is that not all bees prefer the same proportion of nutrients. So like I said, the bumblebee likes one thing and the halictid likes the other, right? So that means that if that's true, what is junk food for one would be a balanced meal for another, right? So what this means, and we don't currently know the nutrient profile of all pollen or the preferences of these bees. So what this means is that we can't yet make species specific statements about pollen, about whether or not one species pollen is junk food compared to the other. But what we can say is that more diversity is probably good. It's probably good, right? So pollen is probably, if your non-native annuals are producing pollen, it's probably good. It's probably fine, right? So let's look at nectar. Nectar is high in carbs, and it's low in nutrients. And we're going to go really fast through this one because we're going to simplify a little bit. But for purposes here, for bees, nectar is nectar. They don't care, and this makes sense because they get their nutrition from pollinators, right? But for butterflies, there might be a little wrinkle here. There might be something interesting. So even though nectar isn't high in protein, it does have some trace amino acids. And these trace amino acids vary by species, plant species. And we've known for a really long time, I think since the 70s, that high amino acid plants on average tend to attract more butterflies. And for the longest time, we had no clue why. Because these high amino acid butterflies were not getting larger. They didn't seem to be benefiting from this in any way. You know, they're done growing, right? So we couldn't figure it out. Well, now we think we might have figured it out. We're not totally sure, but we might have. And what these amino acids might help with is actually reproduction. So if a given caterpillar just doesn't get enough to eat, right? It's on some really low quality food and it just can't get enough nutrition, and it ends up being a really small little runty butterfly, like a really small butterfly, right? Smaller than the rest of its kin, right? If this happens, it might be that they don't have very high quality eggs or very high quality sperm. And maybe it's the case, scientists are starting to think that maybe these amino acids are actually helping them, right? So maybe they'll build up some of these eggs and some of these sexual reproductive organs with these amino acids. And that's why it's helping them, why they have this preference. But it needs more study. It needs more, this is something to keep an eye on. If this is the case, the benefits are probably relatively marginal. Because like I said, it's not necessarily helping the healthy individuals, right? It's helping it's raising the floor, right? It's not necessarily raising the ceiling, it's raising the floor. All right, so what we can probably say, safely say, I think, that nectar is good, right? That these non-native annuals are offering good nectar. Well, what else is there? Production and access. So double flowering varieties are sterile. Most of the time they're sterile. And sterile flowers have no pollen or may have really reduced pollen. And sometimes they have reduced nectar. But the thing is, even if these double flowering varieties have pollen and have nectar in abundance, you can't access them. The pollinators can't access them, right? And a lot of our cultivars that we've created for these annual plants, because they've been in production for a very long time, have things like this because they look really cool. They look really interesting, right? But this causes a problem for pollinators. And of course, just like with every other plant, these non-native annuals, some produce more nectar than others, right? They just have more nectar. So something like salvia is going to have more nectar than something like a petunia, right? And that's just something you have to keep in mind when you're sort of answering these questions. Are my annuals okay, right? So are my annual plants junk food for pollinators? Probably not, except in some specific cases. Non-native annuals can't be host plants for native insects, but they can provide valuable floral resources if they are not cultivars that express deleterious traits like double flowering. And if you're really worried about this, if you want to circumvent this sort of uncertainty, you can plant native plants. Because if you're wanting to help native pollinators specifically, we know for a fact that native plants can support them because they were doing it long before we came here, right? So you can sidestep any uncertainty by just putting in native plants. That said, and this is actually something that Christina in her presentation mentioned. So insects, it's important to keep in mind, they're not robots, right? I really like calling insects nature's widgets, right? But they're not actually little machines, right? They're not little robots. They do have some limited agency. So if a bee comes up to a flower and it gives them nothing, right? There's no flower, there's no nectar, there's no pollen, then it's gonna fly away, right? Maybe it will come back once. Maybe it will come back once just to see if they something had came there before it. But it's you fool it more than a couple times, it's gone, right? It's not gonna come back. So if you have a bunch of annuals, if there are lots of pollinators visiting your favorite annuals, they probably aren't hurting anything. These annuals, these bees, these butterflies are getting something that they like, right? And so you shouldn't have to be too worried about it. Okay. All right, question 6. Can I help pollinators if I can't garden or don't own land? I said yes, and the way that doesn't need a garden have just as much impact. But what am I talking about? I'm talking about community science. Community science can be done in play in not they don't have to be done in your garden, right? They can be done in communal spaces and at special events and so forth, right? So if you're renting and you don't have the ability to put in a garden, you can still have a big impact on pollinators. Just find some community science to do. And these community science projects, they aren't just fun, right? They're not just for fun. They have a really substantial impact on science. So you can see that on the right here, we have somebody doing some community science, marking butterflies. And actually on the left, they're doing that too. In the center, we have actually my boss, Dr. Alex Harmon-Threet, doing a vegetation survey in her neighborhood, right? And she does have a garden, of course, but she's not currently surveying her garden, right? She's just surveying her street. So these are things that you can do without having a garden, right? And these do make really valuable contributions to science. And I'm actually going to use a personal anecdote to illustrate that. So if you look here on the left, we have a map that shows where all of my field locations were for my graduate project, actually. So these are the fields that I went and visited and gathered data from in 2019 and 2020. And I spent a lot of time. I had a lot of help. Some folks in extension helped me. I had a couple student workers for a little bit that were able to help me. And I put a ton of work into this, right? 12-hour days in spring and summer, driving to all these fields and collecting all this data, right? I did all this work and managed to have a huge study compared to a lot of the ones that had happened before it. I had 40 fields and we studied for 2 years. It was huge. And even though this is probably larger than most experiments, we're going to call this standard. We'll call this standard science. What's achievable with standard science under the standard kind of science model. Well, what can community science do? What can community science do? This is what it can do, right? Look at the difference here. So this is 150 different locations that are associated with the iPollinate project, right? And instead of working like I did on the left here for 12 hours for spring and summer for 2 years, these folks are putting in half hour a month, right? Tops, half hour a month. And it's this concept of many hands makes light work, right? And scientists are starting to realize how valuable this kind of work is. The biggest, kind of breeze through this one too. The biggest citizen science project out there is probably the Audubon Christmas bird count. Last year they had almost 77,000 people participating. But because we have these projects that are so large, and we have a couple of these in the insect world too, we're getting pretty good at using community science data because it's a little strange. Community science data is a little strange. It's formatted differently. There's different kind of errors, but we're getting used to it. And we have scientists who've dedicated their lives just to working with community science data. And this work has meant that we've done some real good science. In fact, one of the papers that I referenced during this presentation, one that talked about the resiliency of monarchs, it's actually relied almost entirely on community science data. It relied on monarch tagging, and it relied on monarch counts, butterfly counts that have occurred all across the country, right? So this does really impactful, important science. If you're interested in doing some community science yourself, we do have one here at the University of Illinois. It's iPollinate. It's operated, the day-to-day operations are managed by me, but it's created by Dr. Harmon 3, has 3 parts. First 2 parts, pollinator visitation survey and a monarch survey, those do require that you have a garden. So if you see in the upper left-hand picture here, this is the kind of garden you'd have to plant for that. But bee spotter doesn't require a garden. You can do bee spotter at any time that you want for as long as you want, anywhere, doesn't matter. These have a relatively small time commitment, the top 2 ones, the iPollinate, pollinator visitation survey and the monarch survey. On the 3rd week of the month, at some point in there, you would do a couple observations, probably a half hour a month, maybe a little bit more. And it's 4 months long. And so I encourage anybody that if you want to be a part of some community science, to apply to this. Now, I'm working on getting the training up for this. It's probably not going to be up at least until Monday. So if you want to participate, at least bookmark this link and then try on Monday. Let's see. Okay, so Aaron, do we have time to answer some of these pre-made questions, these pre-submitted questions?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so this one came in. Let's see. Are native plants the best use of sunny garden areas when it comes to, let's see. Are native plants the best use of sunny garden areas when it comes to pollinators, or are annuals and vegetables helpful enough to warrant a spot in a yard with lots of shade? If you enjoy growing vegetables, I recommend that you use the sunny spot for vegetables. People who are engaged with their yard and engaged with gardening consistently are the ones that are making the best pollinator yards, because they're out there and they're seeing where pollinators are going, and they're able to make little changes in their yard to sort of maximize the utility that pollinators can get. So I recommend that if you really want vegetables and it's going to get you out more, absolutely use that sunny spot for your vegetables. All right, what season is typically lacking in floral resources? That is early spring and late fall. But with that said, I think it is more valuable to have a consistent bloom in your yard than it is to have a bunch of blooms at any one point in time. That's because a bee can go there and just knows it can sort of be, you can be on a schedule to just knows that there's something is going to be in your yard at all times, right? And that's really valuable to bees, consistency. All right, talk about annual milkweed. So tropical milkweed, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin name for it, but tropical milkweed, you should avoid it. It doesn't have the same seasonality as the milkweeds that we know here in Illinois. And it can throw off a monarch a sense of time. So it can basically like, oh, well, this is in bloom. I must have another month before I must have another month until the winter comes here. And then winter comes into it, right? So these tropical milkweeds aren't great. And I think they're also invasive in some tropical parts. I don't think they would be invasive here, but they are invasive in some parts of the country, I believe. There's this question about newer flower varieties. So I've heard this about the nectar too. I might defer this question to Aaron, because I don't know about like how long a flower has been in cultivation, if that has an impact on whether or not it provides nectar. But I do know about that a double flowering variety produces very little pollen, or perhaps no pollen, and that they are inaccessible, right? So why does one area of your yard attract butterflies more than another with the same flowers? Insects and plants are both extremely sensitive to microclimates, really sensitive to microclimates. And these microclimates are really small, maybe not necessarily in size, but in difference, right? So one area of your yard could just be drier, just fractionally drier, or maybe it receives fractionally less sun. Or it might just receive wind in a weird way that makes landing difficult, right? The insects are small and they can sort of sense these things way better than we can. You'll have to do some pondering and some experimentation, and hopefully you can find out a way to get the pollinators over there. Maybe you just need different plants or something like that. How do I support local native bees and raise honeybees at the same time? And this is actually a quote from Dr. May Berenbaum. Rising tide lifts all boats. In regards to this sort of perceived conflict between native bees and honeybees. They're all really desperate for floral resources. So if you can provide a ton of floral resources, you're doing good for both of them. If you really want to target those native bees, you could do some cut stems for nesting, right? All right, Erin, I'll hand that back over to you if that's okay. Did you want to answer that? Did you have any answers on this newer flower varieties thing?
Putting me on the spot. No, I don't. I haven't heard that yet, so that's good to know. Something to watch and pay attention to as we move forward. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brody. That was an excellent presentation. Lots of really great research presented for everyone. I really appreciated the deep dive that you took on those questions. As Brody flipped the slide here, we do have an evaluation. If you could just take a couple minutes to either scan that QR code, copy down that link. I'm going to try to get it in the chat, and we will follow up with an email to you all with this information as well following the webinar today. Just one note, we are hoping to reach back out to you about a year from now, just to see if you've implemented any action from information that you learned today. So just that's a heads up that if we reach out to you and say, remember that pollinator webinar that you went to? This is your mental note that, oh yeah, she said we'd be reaching back out. We do have a couple more minutes and we've had a couple really great questions that I want to ask Brody if we can spend a little bit of time looking at.
Thank you for tuning in to CU Wise TV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically for Champaign County older adults. Take care.